the musculature in our body is the first place for us to take up the sugar in our food and put it somewhere. It isn't until we've saturated all the muscle tissue that our body will actually start converting those carbohydrates into fat.
It increases our bone density, which protects against osteoporosis and potential falls. It enhances our balance, our strength, but more importantly, muscle is linked to lower disease and lower death risk.
Welcome to MD Longevity Lab, where we're playing the long game. This is a podcast where science meets real life with expert insights, practical tips, and real-world tools to not only live longer, but live better. Our aim is to radically change the way medicine is practiced and enable individuals to age gracefully, maintaining health span and vitality well into their later years. We're your hosts, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Vikas Patel, physicians, partners in life, and parents balancing work, wellness, and everything in between. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to the MD Longevity Lab podcast, where we are playing the long game.
Today, we're going to be diving right in and talking about muscle health. You'll often hear us say that muscle is the currency of aging, because let's be real, aging is not only just a slow battle against gravity, muscle is going to be your best line of defense.
Right. If you don't actively build muscle, you don't just lose it, you basically start melting right into the couch. And we're kind of here to stop that. We're going to cover the differences between the different types of muscle fibers, fast twitch and slow twitch, why muscle is really your health savings account, and why staying strong may actually protect your brain at the same time. Plus, probably some personal stories, because one of us definitely thought lifting weights would make them look like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yep, that would be me. We grew up with cardio, right? And that myth that if we lift, we're going to get bulky. But I've seen the light. And as it turns out, putting on some muscle for me meant dropping a few pant sizes and gaining strength and confidence. I used to give Vikas my Prosecco bottle to open up. And now I'm like, babe, watch this. And I feel so strong and powerful, just like popping open a bottle of champagne or Prosecco.
Because we're always celebrating.
Yeah, always. We're alive. We're breathing. There's always something to celebrate.
All right, let's get into muscle health and metabolism. Nisha, why does muscle matter so much for our metabolism?
Yeah, so we've talked about in previous episodes how only 12% of us are metabolically healthy, leaving 88% of Americans metabolically unhealthy. And as it turns out, muscle is very metabolically active. An extra 1 pound of muscle burns up to 10 calories a day. And 1 pound of fat burns only 2 calories a day. So putting on 5 pounds of muscle, which I did this year, by the way, it allows me to burn an extra 18,250 calories. And that translates to 5 pounds of pure fat burn throughout the year.
That's a lot of Prosecco.
That's a lot of Prosecco, for sure. That's really one of my motivations for putting on muscle. When you broke it down for me, like, you're allowed to eat more because you just expend more energy when you put on muscle. I was like, done. Where do I start? How much do I lift?
Yeah, it goes on total body size, right? So muscle does burn more calories than our fat tissue does. Total body size matters a lot for how much energy burn our body requires through our metabolism. So if you're tipping the scales by improving body composition, then you're naturally going to end up needing more energy to sustain the muscle, which means that, yes, you get to treat yourself a little better.
Nice.
So muscle is also protective against chronic disease. And this ties in nicely to the metabolism, because muscle is the primary sink for glucose. And so whenever we eat anything, our primary energy source is still carbohydrates. The musculature in our body is the first place for us to take up the sugar in our food and put it somewhere. It isn't until we've saturated all the muscle tissue that our body will actually start converting that those carbohydrates into fat for us to actually store it. And so if we're trying to improve our odds of reducing the risk of diabetes or impaired glucose tolerance, which is one of the main drivers of all sorts of disease processes, then the more muscle tissue we have, the more protected we are from developing impaired glucose tolerance and subsequently those chronic diseases that are related to diabetes. Muscle is also pretty protective for osteoporosis, correct?
Vikas mentioned muscle protects against chronic disease. It improves insulin sensitivity, which lowers our risk of type 2 diabetes. It increases our bone density, which protects against osteoporosis and potential falls. It enhances our balance, our strength, but more importantly, muscle is linked to lower disease and lower death risk. Adults with a higher muscle mass had a 50% lower risk of all-cause mortality. So that's literally a 50% reduction in dying from anything.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. I think it ties in nicely with the fact that when we have this ability to do work, because we have a lot of muscle mass, the protective benefits of being able to carry that muscle are multiple fold in that we do have higher bone density, which protects us from injury when we fall. We have lower risk of chronic disease in the form of impaired glucose tolerance. We know that that drives cardiovascular disease. It drives neurodegenerative conditions. When you combine all of that, that number is pretty staggering that we're reducing our mortality rate by 50%, just knowing that we're in the top quartile of having higher muscle mass compared to the bottom quartile.
I know many of us have a family history of dementia. So how does muscle mass affect your risk of dementia?
Muscle mass reduces your risk of dementia, and it ties into a few things. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at how muscle can improve your odds with neurodegenerative conditions. One way to look at it is that we do know that impaired glucose tolerance is a driver for neurodegenerative conditions. And there is this concept of type 3 diabetes of the brain, where impaired glucose metabolism in the brain is a driver for neurodegenerative conditions. So again, if you have more muscle mass and you are disposing of sugar correctly, the likelihood of you developing that type 3 diabetes of the brain is much lower. The other part of this that's interesting is that in order for you to maintain muscle mass, you have to move and you have to do exercise. The actual act of doing the movement requires our brain to do a lot of work. And if we're just sitting watching a screen, our brain doesn't have to really do much calculation. It's not really having to calculate anything other than just paying attention to whatever the entertainment is on the screen. But when we're physically moving and we're trying to calculate the risk of this bar falling on my chest, making sure that I'm staying balanced through a movement, making sure that my eyes are paying attention to where my feet are going to fall if I'm doing box jumps and I'm guiding and I'm coming back down, all of the calculation that your body has to do to maintain your muscle mass during exercise is very neuroprotective. We know that people who are constantly engaged in these neuroprotective activities have lower rates of neurodegenerative conditions.
Yeah, I feel smarter when I lift.
There's actually studies that show that
Really?
you are smarter after you exercise.
I mean, that's pretty hard to top.
Yeah.
I was pretty smart before lifting.
Now you're a genius.
Now I'm a genius. I can do 7 pull-ups. That's like Mensa level right there.
That's 1,600 on SATs.
Pretty much.
Yeah, there you go.
Let's touch on how muscle health affects cancer. So I shared my diagnosis with all of you during our first episode. After doing our deep dive into the literature, we learned that higher muscle mass improves outcomes in patients with cancer and lowers complication rates. The other interesting thing that I did not know is 30% of cancer patients don't die of cancer. They die of something called sarcopenia, which is muscle loss. And I found that really impactful because other than obviously seeing your oncologist and undergoing chemotherapy or radiation or whatever the treatment is for your specific type of cancer, knowing that you have the power to improve your prognosis of cancer is so empowering. I know it was for me.
Yeah, essentially, having higher muscle mass is protective from getting cancer. We know that because all-cause mortality is reduced. Number two, if you end up having cancer, cancer treatment in its current form is essentially we try to cut out the cancer. So we have to undergo some type of major surgery and recover from that. When we're recovering, we typically need to draw upon our energy stores. So the more muscle mass we have, the more likely it is that we can recover. The chemotherapy that's used for treatment, it's a poison to the cancer, but it's certainly a poison to us. We're just hoping that the cancer is being poisoned quicker than we are being poisoned. Again, we have to draw upon our energy stores. We can't select which energy stores that our body's going to draw from. It will draw from all of them, meaning it will draw from fat stores, but it will also draw from muscle stores. The people who have the highest muscle mass are the ones that are going to survive and recover from their very complicated and arduous cancer treatment typically.
Yeah. So after learning that, I started prioritizing muscle. I thought, you know what? Now knowing this information, I have to do something about it. Another important impact that muscle has on our health and longevity, more muscle result in lower inflammation markers, lower inflammatory markers. Muscles secrete myokine, which have anti-aging properties.
The anti-inflammatory effect of muscle is pretty powerful. And I think in the social media crowd, people love to talk about inflammation, and there's these huge misconceptions on what it takes to drive down inflammation, that we can just do it by eating this supplement or this regimen of medications or something is going to reduce our total body inflammation. The natural way to reduce inflammation is exercise and building muscle tissue. And when we're using our muscle tissue, the regenerative thing that happens during recovery is actually very anti-inflammatory. And this is why people who are relatively fit do not suffer from chronic disease in nearly the same amounts as the people who are not fit.
Yeah, I find it interesting because we have a lot of patients that ask about NAD and peptide and all these buzzwords that we hear in the longevity scene. If we don't have these foundational parts in place, all of that stuff, it just doesn't matter. You can take all the NAD, take all the peptides in the world, but if you don't have an appropriate amount of lean muscle mass, that NAD and peptide isn't benefiting you. The supplements are that last 1%. These big foundational things like building muscle mass, getting your VO2 max up, getting your sleep corrected. These are those foundational things that we should be correcting before starting supplements.
Absolutely. It doesn't make any sense to potentially get a 1% or 2% improvement through a supplement when you would get a 50, 60, 70% improvement by proper lifestyle modification, and potentially even more if you consider something like VO2 max can give you a 400% improvement in mortality. There's just no comparison to something like NAD, which today there's very little studies that are out there that convincingly prove that there is truly a benefit. Nobody has looked at mortality in NAD. Nobody has looked at total body inflammation in NAD. And so to say that theoretically this should help, yes, theoretically it should, but we haven't found any studies that prove for a fact that they actually do help.
Most definitely. So Vikas, give us a little bit of background into the muscle fibers. What is the difference between a fast twitch muscle fiber and a slow twitch muscle fiber?
The first one that we'll talk about is the slow twitch fiber, and that is the type 1 muscle fiber. And this is the one that gives us the endurance. So day to day, when we're just walking around doing normal type of office work, working around the house, we're using our slow twitch muscle fibers. And these are not fibers that are giving us an explosive power, but they're really geared towards we can keep doing this for a very long period of time. The type 2 fibers are the fast twitch fibers. And those are the ones that we need for explosive power. Those are the ones that we need for sprinting. And this is also why when you look at athletes, you can tell what type of athlete they are by looking at them because the morphology of those fibers are different. For instance, when you look at a marathon runner, they're typically very lean and they're skinny. And those muscle fibers that they have, those slow twitch muscle fibers, they're not super bulky. You look at a sprinter and the sprinters are very muscular. Though they have those fast twitch fibers, which is what's adding that muscle bulk and giving them the ability to do an immense amount of work in a very short period of time. Those muscle fibers do not have endurance. So, you're pretty much done. You've used up all of the energy that's stored in the muscle tissue within a minute. You've used it all up because you're using it so fast.
Let's touch a little bit on the aging impact of muscle health. So fast twitch fibers decline faster with age than slow twitch muscle fibers. And muscle mass naturally declines if you are not training starting in your 30s. That can be anywhere from 3 to 10% per decade. So by the age of 80, one might lose up to 50% of their muscle mass. And muscle is what's going to protect you from all these chronic diseases. It's going to give you strength to go up the stairs. Those type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers are what's going to stop you from a fall. So if you are not training with intention on growing those muscles, preserving what you have, that's going to end up being a problem as early as in your 60s.
Exactly, Nisha. So because we tend to lose those muscle fibers that give us that explosive energy, it is the biggest risk, as you mentioned, with falls. And that's one of the things that we specifically try to train for is to maintain some of that explosive power, because we all have this idea that we peak in speed. You're not seeing any 65-year-old sprinter who's running at even anywhere close to the same pace that a 25-year-old sprinter might run at. And that's because we have this loss of the fast twitch fiber. That doesn't mean that we're going to completely lose them. And it doesn't mean that we can maintain some proficiency well into our old age. It's just, we have to actually keep using them in order to maintain that proficiency. And so it requires a certain type of training in order to do that. And so doing exercises where we're doing single leg lunges or doing jumping plyometrics onto an elevated platform, those are things that are requiring us to use those fast twitch muscle fibers. And the goal isn't that we keep the same speed or force production that we had when we were 25, but we want to be able to do it well enough, not just the jump up onto the box, but also the jump back down, which is the eccentric, and allows our muscles to adapt for when we're walking downstairs, which is where you fall. You don't fall going up the stairs. All of the people that I take care of in the emergency room, they're typically falling on the way down the stairs because their muscles are not in shape to do the eccentric, the lengthening out where they can do it in a very slow, progressive manner and still keep their balance. And so we have to do that type of training of those faster twitch fibers in order to maintain that type of health.
Yeah. And it's important to mention that we're not doing it for bodybuilding, for aesthetic purposes. That's a nice side effect, right? You tend to look better as you age if you have muscle. We're doing it for functionality. Why do we wear a seatbelt in the car? We're preparing in the event we get into an accident, right? So we prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and that's how we live most aspects of our life. It's interesting because when we approach aging, we don't look at it that way right now. With our 401ks, we make small deposits knowing that we have to prepare for retirement. But when we approach our body and our health, we just go into it blind as a society, hoping for the best, but we're not really preparing our patients for the worst. And I think it's a difficult conversation to initiate, but at some point, all of us are going to fall. We have to be prepared for that. Having that conversation with patients, we are not preparing you for training for a weightlifting competition. We're training so that you can recover from whatever injury you might sustain.
This is a unique problem, right? And we're having to play catch up because from a societal standpoint, we just didn't live this long up until very recently. We didn't have this level of convenience in life up until recently. We didn't have, and along the lines of convenience, we didn't have an ample supply of food. And all of those things were before allowing us the amount of work we had to do just to live was keeping us prepared for if we did make it into our 70s and 80s, that we were still actually going to be able to be active. Nowadays, because of all of the convenience that's crept in, we have this unique problem where modern medicine has gotten us to a point where, average lifespans do hit 80, right? And that means there's people living into their late 80s, 90s, but how functional are they? Well, we have to actually train ourselves to be functional at those ages. And we can't just assume that our body's going to work fine because we're not evolutionarily doing the same things that we were even 60, 70 years ago. Life looked different than what it does right now.
We have patients in their 40s that had low back pain, knee pain, arthritis, and they're afraid to lift because it hurts. It's a hard sell. Do this thing because it's going to decrease your pain from your osteoarthritis. But every time you do it, you're in pain. There's a point where you cross that threshold, though, where you are putting on muscle and giving your back, that joint that's been hurting you, support. That joint is getting the signals from muscle that it has to strengthen.
The growth and maintenance of the muscle tissue through exercise releases those myokines, which are anti-inflammatory. So believe it or not, there's numerous studies that show that even if you have knee arthritis and you do leg strengthening exercises, your knee pain feels better. It sounds so counterintuitive that for that to make sense. And so, your first rep when your knees are still stiff, you're going to have a little flare of pain. But once you're 10 minutes into your exercise, you're not feeling that arthritis pain anymore. And the overall long-term benefit is that your arthritis pain is actually reduced because of the anti-inflammatory effect of the exercise that you're doing. And so it sounds so counterintuitive and it's a tough sell to patients, but there's numerous studies that actually show that this is the case, that the patients who are doing these physical therapy regimens with sufficient energy expenditure, where they're getting to that point where they're actually in that range where they can only do 1 or 2 more reps, right? They're getting that fatigue in their exercise. When they have sufficient energy output, they end up actually having a better long-term outcome from their arthritis pain.
Another study that I read that was pretty interesting. So if you had to pick between stretching and strength training, what do you think prevents injury more? Stretching or strength training?
Strength training, 100%.
Do you know the numbers? So stretching actually reduces injury by anywhere from 0 to 4%. That's it. Strength training reduces injury by 69%.
There was a big shift from when you and I were kids. We used to do these static stretches. I played soccer and we would do these static stretches as a warm up. Numerous studies have proven since then that dynamic stretching is actually the way to go and is much better at injury prevention. Dynamic stretching is you're actually using your musculature and you're moving through the range of motions that your muscles would normally do in the activities that you're actually trying to do. So if you're playing soccer, there's a lot of dynamic movement. You're lunging, you're cutting, and your stretches need to reflect that. What you're saying about the actual exercise of doing resistance training, it makes all the sense in the world. If you're doing resistance training correctly, you're going through most of the range of motion that all these muscles are supposed to do. And it forces our body to maintain the muscle correctly, which is what you really need for injury prevention.
Our system is kind of designed for procedures. They go see their back pain doctor and the doctor's like, okay, don't move. Here's a steroid shot. Here's some pain medication. And I think we're learning now that that's about the worst thing that we can do, which is limit your range of motion. So if you don't use it, you're going to lose it.
When there's an injury, the immobilization phase is the very acute phase where you're in tremendous pain and you resting for a couple of days to get out of that tremendous pain phase. That's fine. But the second you're out of the tremendous pain phase, you have to get back to some semblance of normal activity. And once the pain has become manageable, then you got to move into active movement phase where you're actually doing low levels of resistance, nothing strenuous to exacerbate or repeat an injury, but starting to give your body the stimulus that, okay, I need to make this better. I need to maintain the musculature. And then as you improve further and further, then you can start adding more and more level of resistance into this. You had touched on what happens with muscle loss over time and especially bed rest. Just to end cap that, there's some studies that have shown that just 1 week of bed rest in young adults, that they can lose about 1% of their muscle mass in just 1 week. And that's young people, right? So this is the under 40 crowd. When we start looking at older adults in a 10-day hospitalization, they're not moving very much in the hospital. They can lose as much as 10% of their total muscle mass in just 10 days. And so that is an immense number. Like, yes, you can get that back, but it's not the same thing getting it back when you're 60 years old as it was when you were 20 years old.
You have a 60-year-old who has a pneumonia, or someone who's 70 undergoing chemotherapy and they're inpatient, they're bed bound. And if they stay inpatient and they're not getting out of bed, they're losing muscle at such an alarming rate that sometimes they never actually leave the hospital walking. And that's a real tragedy, right?
I agree.
So we've talked about why muscle mass is so important, why we should start training as soon as we can, before the age of 30, before that decline. But we've also learned that it's never too late to put on muscle. So even if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, and you've never lifted a weight in your life, I didn't start weightlifting till my 40s. I was very intimidated, but it is never too late to put on muscle. Let's talk a little bit about the best ways to build and maintain muscle.
There's a lot of different ways to build and maintain muscle, but they all share some commonalities. So part of this is nutrition, and part of this is making sure that we are providing enough stimulus for the muscle tissue. Why don't you just tell us about your own personal journey on resistance training and where you started and where you are currently?
When we started Longevity Lab, I was 40 and in decent shape. I mean, I ran marathons in my 20s. I continue to run, but the majority of my workouts were centered around cardio activity. And I did not particularly enjoy resistance training or weightlifting. I think I was just intimidated by the equipment. When we first did my DEXA scan in the office, I learned that I was the bottom 9th percentile for lean muscle mass. So I was on track to be sarcopenic.
And that's despite having a great VO2 max. So you were in the top quartile for VO2 max, but from a pure muscle strength standpoint and muscle mass standpoint, you were lacking a little bit.
That's a polite word. Elaborate, Vikas. Get you in trouble. No.
And then what happened over time?
Vikas has been encouraging me to lift. We've been married almost 15 years. And he's like, yeah, that purple weight isn't quite going to do it. And he just kind of say things. And I'm like, I don't want to hear it. Let me do my workout. And after seeing the metrics and learning about the impact of muscle health on cancer, learning about the impact of muscle health on cognitive function, having a family history of dementia, I have to do this. I have to get my muscle health in order. So I committed to doing 3 days a week of resistance training. I set a lofty goal for myself because that's usually what I do. I think I had told Vikas, like, I'm going to be able to do a pull-up in a month because that's just how I roll.
Yeah, and I was very supportive.
Yeah, he just gave me the usual look like, And as it turns out, pull-ups are really hard. It did not happen in 1 month. I started with dead hangs and the bands. And eventually a year later, I was able to do 1 pull-up. And now 2 years later, I'm able to do 7. But in that 1 year time frame, I put on 5 pounds of muscle. I dropped 2 pant sizes. So while I'm heavier on the scale because muscle weighs more than fat, I've lost 3 full pounds of fat. I'm stronger. Things hurt less. My arthritis has gotten better.
I don't think we've mentioned that. But so apart from your cancer diagnosis, also luckily have ankylosing spondylitis, which causes for you sacroiliac joint pain. So that's pain at the junction between the pelvis and the spine. And that's been a chronic pain that you've had pretty much since
My
you were
20s.
pregnant with Mac, the first time that you started mentioning it with regularity. And
Yeah, and that's an autoimmune condition.
Yep.
Ankylosing spondylitis is similar to rheumatoid arthritis, but ankylosing spondylitis affects the big joints. So it can be the spine, back, hips. And as it turns out, putting on some muscle reduces inflammation, improves the arthritis. So yeah, I mean, knock on wood, but I haven't had arthritis pain.
really been about a year since you've even really mentioned it.
Yeah.
Which is just crazy remarkable given how before it'd be like you'd have 2 good months and then you'd have one really bad month and then one good month and then a bad month again. And it was pretty regular.
I know the data, you told me what to do, but I think when you see the metrics on yourself and you wake up every day feeling a little bit better, it just motivates me to keep doing it. And the cool thing about it, now I actually enjoy weightlifting because I feel strong, I feel powerful. I've been able to scale back now that I put on some muscle mass. I don't need to put as much time into my workouts. I'm literally just expending more energy, just breathing, having 5 extra pounds of muscle, and I'm able to resistance train 1 to 2 days a week to keep that muscle mass on. So once you put on some of that muscle, it's way easier to maintain.
Yeah, so we started this conversation with how to build and maintain the muscle. So what Nisha didn't say is that she went from the 9th percentile in muscle mass, and with that body composition change, she went up to the 35th percentile in about 10 months. And so it does not take that long to see significant results. When we're designing a workout regimen for somebody who's not particularly trained, they're not an athlete, the idea here is that you don't want to get injured and you want to get familiar with the different movement patterns. And the main thing is that we want to do these compound movements. Basically, what compound movement means is that you're using multiple muscle groups at one time. And so things like if you're doing a squat or if you're doing a deadlift, in a deadlift, you're essentially picking up weight from the ground and going to a standing position. And we do this in our day-to-day lives all the time, right? Like we pick something, we lean over and pick something up. Well, there's a right way and a wrong way to do that so we don't injure our back and we are loading our quads and our butt correctly without injuring our back at the same time. And we have to learn the correct movement pattern so that we can do this correctly without injury. The main issue is making sure that we learn how to do the movement pattern first with no resistance or very little resistance so that we don't get hurt. Once we're comfortable with that, then we're slowly doing something called progressive overload. And what that means is you're exercising to a point where you're fatiguing the muscle. And I talk to my patients about how many reps in reserve they're going to have. And I think that was the concept that for you that probably had to change the most compared to how you were exercising previously, going to a point where you're getting pretty close to failure, where you're fatiguing the muscles enough. In our generation and maybe the generation before ours, women, I think, were very much taught that you're supposed to just use low weights and do high reps.
And tone your body.
That toning isn't really a thing.
No.
Toning really, what somebody who looks toned, what that really means is that they have a low body fat percentage. It doesn't really mean that their muscles are something, that they're actually in really good shape. It means that they look good because they have low body fat percentage, so their muscles stick out more. But in order for your muscles to actually be in good shape, they have to be exercised to a point where when you're doing a series of sets of a particular exercise, you're fatiguing them enough that they have a stimulus to repair themselves and grow. In order to fatigue them enough, when you're finishing a set, you can really only have 1 or 2 repetitions left in the tank. And that's what reps in reserve is. And I think that was probably the thing that you adjusted the most in order to see all those big gains that you developed. So nutrition is the other component of building muscle. So if we're doing the resistance training, and we will talk in later episodes about specific compound movements that make the most sense for patients. But this is just to give you a brief overview. And this is really where your protein intake matters. Protein is the essential building block. There's 9 essential amino acids, and we have to have all of those amino acids in order to be able to do all of our bodily functions. And one of those is to maintain our muscle mass. If you're doing resistance training, you are literally making micro tears in your musculature. When your body repairs the muscle with the protein that you're eating in your diet, it builds it back stronger and bulkier, essentially. And so if you don't eat enough protein, then you cannot actually repair the musculature adequately, and you will not see those strength gains that you should be seeing with the work that you're putting in. So what are the kind of protein targets that you try to go for every day?
I'm shooting for 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. And for me, that's 120 pounds. I remember when I first heard that, I was like, how the heck am I supposed to eat 120 grams of protein? This is going to be impossible. And I just started loosely tracking what I was eating on a daily basis. And I was getting between 30 to 50 grams. And that's with a protein bar, thinking I'm really getting enough protein. And as it turns out, on our nutritional label, that amount of protein that's required is literally the minimum amount of protein for our body to just function, right? So it's not optimal. It's just the minimum amount.
Yeah, the recommended daily allowance, the RDA, is 0.8 grams per kilogram. So the 2 categories of people who need to eat the amount of protein that you referenced, which loosely, 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight or 2 grams per kilogram, that's the amount that you need if you're truly actively trying to build muscle, or if you're very interested in weight loss, because protein is very filling. It takes our body longer to metabolize it. And so if you're eating a higher proportion of protein, it's truly just an appetite suppressant. The amount of calories that we net to our body from 1 gram of protein is less than the amount of calories that we net from 1 gram of carbs and 1 gram of fat. So literally, if you eat the same volume or the same mass of food, whether it's protein, carbs, or fat, the protein actually gives you the least amount of calorie load to the body, which is why if you're eating a high protein diet, when you're trying to lose weight, it's more effective. When you're exercising, the main goal is that we want to have plenty of protein in order to make sure that we're never lacking for substrates to build our muscles. And so as long as you're somewhere in that 1.6 grams per kilogram up to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein, then you're going to hit that benchmark. And so your goal of trying to hit 120 grams is perfect. You're not going to get it every day, and you don't need to. But if you're getting somewhere between 90 and 120, then you're always going to have enough.
That's the intimidating part for a lot of people, is when they start tracking it, it feels like this monumental effort. I'm never going to get to 120. But it took me about 6 months of gradually building up to that. And 5 days a week, we're pretty much eating the same things. We're still enjoying ourselves. But for the most part, we have our routine. Whoever's up in the morning first makes 2 whey protein shakes. And that's what we're doing 6 days a week. So at least we're starting the day with about 60 grams of protein.
Yeah. So we start our day with between 50 and 60 grams of protein in the form of a protein shake with fresh fruits and vegetables and skim milk and protein powder. Then it's more a matter of making sure that we have the right snack foods in order to get another 30 or 40 grams of protein in throughout the day. And then we're not really paying that much attention to what we're truly eating for lunch and dinner, because we're typically going to eat some meat with those meals, and that will get us another 30, 40 grams of protein. And so, Some of the things that I enjoy, Greek yogurt, almonds, pistachios. I will drink those protein milks occasionally, beef jerky, edamame snacks. Like there's plenty of foods that have 10, 15, 20 grams of protein in them that are easy snack foods that in between meals, if I'm knocking out another 30 or 40 grams of protein, then I don't even have to pay attention to what my other two meals, what the protein content is going to be in those meals.
It's hard to overeat protein because such a small amount fills you up. So
I think we want to just touch on a couple of practical takeaways here.
So to wrap up, strength training is going to be your 401k. Muscle, from a vanity standpoint, it's the Spanx of aging, and it really keeps everything in place. So for those of you who aren't quite at that age where you're starting to think about preparing for your later years, muscle is going to benefit you aesthetically.
I'm wearing Spanx right now. Correct. Muscle is the Spanx of aging. It does keep everything in place, right? I mean, let's face it, it does make us look better, but more importantly, it makes us function better, which is the whole goal. We want to make sure that we are training both fast and slow twitch fibers, right? So Nisha has signed us up for a half marathon that we're running soon. Part of my training is to do very slow cardio where I'm running without much effort for long distances, which is training those slow twitch fibers. But then I also any good running program will have you do sprints periodically. And that's to train the fast twitch fibers. And so even for people who are runners, they should be breaking their training regimen into those slow days and those fast days. And weightlifting is the same thing where we're using a combination of fibers even in weightlifting to do this correctly. So we have to train both of those fibers to maintain them, because especially those fast twitch fibers are the ones that deteriorate as we get older. We have to do something to maintain them.
And those fast twitch fibers are the muscle tissue that's responsible for stopping a fall, really being intentional about training not only slow twitch muscle fibers, but fast twitch. We also know that muscle boosts metabolism. It protects our bones, helps increase our bone density. It lowers our risk of diabetes and metabolic dysfunction. Increasing our muscle mass also decreases our risk of dementia, cancer, and early death.
Correct. By 50%, I believe you said.
Yeah.
Muscle is definitely one of those use it or lose it propositions. Muscle naturally declines by about 1% every year of our life after the age of about 35. And it does not have to. You can actually gain muscle mass pretty much at any point in your life, but it requires us to actually do something in order to maintain it. The biggest thing that we get super worried about is when we have forced inactivity. So if you get sick and you end up in the hospital and you're laid up in a bed for 10 days, you can lose literally 10% of your muscle mass in that 10-day period. And that's why it's so important for us to have a large reserve volume of muscle to be that insurance policy in case the unexpected happens.
Oh, yeah. I'm always preparing for the unexpected with my diagnosis. In the event something happens where I'm hospitalized, I need enough muscle reserve to leave the hospital walking and functioning. So that's one of my goals. As a byproduct, I think when you have a little extra muscle, you look better, clothes fit better, you feel better, you move better. But I think in the long run, you're also preparing for the worst.
Yeah. Think about it. Every day in the hospital, like when people leave the hospital after hospitalization, the vast majority of them, we wheel them out in a wheelchair out to the parking lot, out to the exit, and then they have to stand up and go walk to the car, right? Like we're wheeling them out because they're that deconditioned after having spent however much time in the hospital that they can't walk, or we can't guarantee that they're actually going to be steady enough to get out. But then the second they get to the threshold of the hospital, they're on their own, right? And so you're dead on that we have to prepare for this and make sure that we're doing something.
If I get hospitalized, I need you to bring me some dumbbells and I want you to install a pull-up bar for the bed.
Over your bed.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, to wrap up, strength training is really up there with VO2 max training. They're kind of tied for your number one strategy for anti-aging. And muscle, it really is the currency of aging. The more of it that you have, the richer and more quality your health span will be. Thank you so much for joining us today for the MD Longevity Lab podcast, where we are playing the long game. And
lift something heavy, eat your protein, and thank us when you're still crushing it at 90.
Take care, guys.
Good night. Peace out.
Or
Copy that. Roger that.
Whiskey Tango Foxtrot.
Over and out. See ya. Wouldn't want to beat ya.
Thank you for playing the long game with MD Longevity Lab. You can visit us at www.mdlongevitylab.com to learn more about how we can support you on your journey. Stay connected with us on social media at MD Longevity Lab for tips, updates, and behind-the-scenes insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you subscribed, left us a rating, or shared it with someone you know who's also playing the long game. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.